He was the quiet man in the shadows of the Grand Ole Opry, the guitarist who held legends together without ever stealing the spotlight. For 60 years, Jimmy Capps strummed his way into the very soul of country music. To fans, he was the humble backbone of the Opry, but behind closed doors, even this kind-hearted man carried secrets. In his final years, Jimmy Capps finally broke his silence, naming 7 Grand Ole Opry artists he could not stand. Some of the names will shock you, some you may have guessed all along, but together they reveal a side of Nashville that the public was never meant to see. Jimmy Capps was never the loudest voice in the room. He didn't chase headlines, and he certainly didn't seek the spotlight. Yet, behind the glow of the Grand Ole Opry stage lights, his guitar strings told the story of country music itself. For decades, Capps was known simply as the man in back, a quiet force whose playing defined the sound of Nashville, even if his name wasn't the one fans cheered. Born in Fayetteville, North Carolina in 1939, Jimmy grew up in a small town where church hymns and country melodies carried through the air like everyday conversation. His earliest memories weren't of fame or ambition, but of the comfort a guitar could bring. By the time he was a teenager, Jimmy had already shown a gift for music so undeniable that local bands eagerly welcomed him into their fold. His raw talent stood out, even in an era when the South seemed to produce gifted pickers on every corner. At just 19 years old, Jimmy caught the break that would define his career. He auditioned for the Louvin Brothers, one of the most respected duos in country music history. Charlie and Ira Louvin, known for their flawless harmonies and uncompromising standards, didn't make space for just anyone. But when young Jimmy picked up his guitar, they heard something special. That night, Jimmy was hired. He would later recall the experience as both terrifying and exhilarating. He wasn't just playing songs, he was playing for his future. From that moment forward, Jimmy's life intertwined with the very heart of Nashville. In 1960, he stepped onto the stage of the Grand Ole Opry, the place that would become his second home for the rest of his life. Unlike many musicians who cycled in and out of the Opry spotlight, Jimmy stayed. He became a permanent member of the Opry House Band, playing backup for legends like George Jones, Tammy Wynette, and Alan Jackson. If the Opry was country music's cathedral, then Jimmy Capps was its organist, always there, always faithful, always essential. But here's the remarkable part. Despite being surrounded by some of the most colorful personalities in the business, stars known for egos, rivalries, and backstage drama, Jimmy remained calm, steady, and approachable. He wasn't flashy, he didn't compete, he simply played. And yet, in doing so, he gained the kind of respect that fame could never buy. Musicians trusted him, singers leaned on him. Even in rehearsal, Jimmy had a way of making every note feel right, every mistake feel fixable. For most fans, Jimmy Capps was a mystery. He rarely gave interviews, and when he did, he spoke with humility, often redirecting attention to the artists he supported. But among Nashville insiders, there was no mystery at all. They knew Jimmy was the glue holding countless performances together. When a singer faltered, Jimmy's steady guitar line carried them through. When a band lost rhythm, Jimmy's quiet nod and unwavering tempo set them back on track. Over time, he became more than just a musician. He became an institution. Nashville studio recordings, he was there. The Opry stage every weekend, he was there. Tribute concerts, televised specials, even surprise collaborations. If you heard country music between 1960 and 2020, chances are you heard Jimmy Capps, whether you knew it or not. This is why the rumors surrounding him were so shocking. For a man who built his reputation on kindness, humility, and professionalism, the idea that Jimmy Capps might have harbored resentment or even hatred toward his peers was difficult to imagine. Could the quiet man in back have carried private grudges, frustrations, or disappointments? Or was this just another myth in a world where legends are larger than life and whispers grow louder than the truth? To answer that question, we first have to understand the world Jimmy lived in. Because while he seemed immune to the chaos, the Grand Ole Opry wasn't always the wholesome family fans imagined, and even the kindest man in Nashville might have had his breaking points. For the millions of fans who tuned in or packed the pew-like seats of the Ryman Auditorium and later the Opry House, the Grand Ole Opry seemed like heaven on earth, a place where tradition met talent, where country stars stood shoulder to shoulder, and where every Saturday night was a celebration of American music. But behind the curtain, it was often a very different story. The Opry was less of a church and more of a kingdom. And like all kingdoms, it had its rivalries, jealousies, and power struggles. The Opry wasn't just a stage, it was a proving ground. If an artist could earn their way into its circle, they weren't just making music, they were cementing a legacy. Membership meant status, influence, and for many, survival in an industry. That could be brutal. But membership also came with unspoken rules, backstage politics, and plenty of opportunities for resentment to grow. Jimmy Capps, with his steady guitar and quiet professionalism, lived through these tensions. He saw the best and the worst of Nashville. Some artists treated the Opry like a family reunion, where friendships and mutual respect guided every note. Others treated it like a battlefield, where one wrong move could cost you your reputation or your career. Backstage, the Opry was not always the warm, welcoming environment that fans imagined. Stories circulated of stars who refused to share, dressing rooms who demanded extra time on stage, or who pulled rank to get better slots in the lineup. For some, humility stopped at the footlights. And while the audience never saw the tension, musicians like Jimmy did. He was the silent observer, the man who heard the arguments, watched the feuds, and played his part, regardless of who stood at the microphone. And yet, his quiet demeanor meant he was rarely pulled into the fights. To most, Jimmy seemed untouchable, a neutral figure who commanded respect simply by staying out of the noise. But neutrality wasn't always easy. Imagine spending decades in an environment where egos clashed weekly, where gossip traveled faster than guitar riffs, and where jealousy simmered under the surface of every standing ovation. For someone as steady as Jimmy, this could be exhausting. And while he never spoke out publicly, insiders wondered whether he harbored private frustrations. Could it be that behind the smile, behind the soft-spoken reputation, Jimmy had his own unspoken list of grievances? To understand the answer, we have to look at what the Opry really demanded of its artists. Membership wasn't just about talent. It was about loyalty. Stars were expected to show up, perform, and carry the weight of tradition on their shoulders. Some embraced that responsibility, others resented it, clashing with management or fellow performers. The Opry could make or break careers, and it did both. And then there were the divides. Generational divides, stylistic divides, even cultural divides. Traditionalists who guarded the Opry's heritage looked down on the new wave of performers, bringing rock, pop, or outlaw influences into the sacred circle. Meanwhile, younger stars often saw the old guard as stubborn, unwilling to evolve, and quick to criticize. The tension was palpable. Jimmy, standing in the middle, was forced to bridge those divides. He played for the old legends. He played for the newcomers. He played for those who showed kindness and for those who demanded perfection. His guitar didn't choose sides, but Jimmy, the man behind it, may have quietly kept score. This is where whispers began. Whispers that despite his reputation, Jimmy Capps had opinions, strong ones, that he admired some artists but couldn't stand others, that he respected hard work and humility but had no patience for arrogance or entitlement, that after decades of serving the Opry faithfully, he could name the few who had tested his patience, maybe even crossed a line. Of course, these whispers remained just that, rumors. Jimmy rarely spoke in anger, but in his later years, some close friends suggested that he finally began to open up. He didn't do it in front of cameras or in official interviews, but in private conversations, Jimmy reportedly shared stories, naming names of the artists who had rubbed him the wrong way, who had made his life harder, and who, in his eyes, had failed to honor the Opry spirit. Was this bitterness, or was it honesty? The kind of truth that comes only after a lifetime of service, when the need for politeness fades and candor takes its place. Whatever the case, one thing is clear. The Grand Ole Opry was never the perfect family it pretended to be. And even for a man as humble and kind as Jimmy Capps, the constant undercurrent of tension left its mark. As we dig deeper, we'll explore the stories that began to surface in his final years. Stories about the 7 Opry artists Jimmy Capps reportedly couldn't stand. Some names will shock you, some won't surprise you at all, but together, they reveal not only the man Jimmy was, but also the hidden battles that defined the Opry stage. Jimmy Capps passed away on June 1, 2020, at the age of 81. The news sent a ripple of sadness through Nashville. For most fans, his name was unfamiliar, but for those inside the circle of country music, his absence was immeasurable. The man in back was gone, and with him, an era quietly ended. Tributes poured in from legends and newcomers alike. Vince Gill called him the backbone of the Opry. Ricky Skaggs described him as the most dependable soul you could ever ask for. Country greats who rarely agreed on anything agreed on this. Jimmy Capps wasn't just a guitarist. He was the Opry's heart. But in the months following his passing, stories began to circulate. Not dramatic exposés or scandalous revelations, but tender, private recollections from friends and family. Stories about Jimmy's humor, his gentle corrections when a young musician missed a chord, his patience when a star demanded impossible rehearsals. And yes, even those private conversations in which he finally admitted the truth. There were artists he simply could not stand. The fact that Jimmy waited until late in life to speak up says something powerful about his character. He wasn't driven by bitterness. He wasn't trying to start feuds or tarnish reputations. Instead, he was finally telling his truth, a truth he had carried silently for decades. After 60 years of smiling through the chaos, he had earned the right to be candid. And yet, even in criticism, Jimmy was measured. He never lashed out. He never called anyone talentless or unworthy. His frustrations always came back to values: respect, humility, dedication to the music. The 7 artists he named weren't despised because of their voices or their talent. They were criticized because, in his eyes, they had betrayed the spirit of the Opry. That is perhaps the greatest insight into who Jimmy Capps really was. At his core, he wasn't just a musician. He was a guardian, a protector of tradition, a man who believed the Opry was bigger than any one star, any one ego, any one feud. And for all his quietness, his refusal to step into the spotlight, he understood the weight of that responsibility better than anyone. Today, when we look back at Jimmy's career, it's easy to focus on the numbers. 60 years at the Opry, thousands of performances, countless recordings, but numbers can't capture his essence. What really defined Jimmy Capps was his integrity. He stood for something rare in the entertainment industry: selflessness. Even as the spotlight passed him by, Jimmy never seemed to care. Fame wasn't his currency. Respect was. And in that regard, he died one of the richest men in Nashville. So, what do we take away from Jimmy's story? That even the most humble among us carry private frustrations. That even the kindest man in the room notices arrogance, ego, and disrespect. And that honesty, even when it comes late in life, is part of one's legacy. As the curtain fell on his extraordinary life, Jimmy Capps left behind more than just music. He left behind a reminder that greatness isn't measured in applause, but in the quiet ways you hold others up. And perhaps, in the end, that's why his final candid words matter so much. They remind us that truth has a place, even in an industry built on appearances. Jimmy Capps may no longer be strumming in the shadows of the Opry stage, but his presence still lingers in every note played there today. And as long as country music lives, the man in back will never truly be gone.